Hey friends, welcome to another reading vlog. I'm really excited about this one because I've set myself up for success, and hopefully that means that I'm going to be having a lot of 5-star reads in this video. Cross your fingers and toes for me. I'm amazing at starting new series, but what I'm terrible at is continuing them. So in this video, I'm going to be picking up the next installment in a variety of series that I am in the midst of. All of these series I have given 5 stars in the past, either to every installment I've read of them, or at the very least one of the installments, in the hopes that the next books in the series will also be 5-star reads, and I'll have lots of amazing experiences in this video, maybe find some new favorites, just generally have a great time reading. So let me talk you through all the options I have. First, I have Legends and Lattes, which I gave 5 stars, and the prequel, I think it's a prequel, Bookshops Bonedust. Legends and Lattes is a favorite of mine, so I'm sure that I will love the cozy vibes of Bookshops Bonedust. Continuing in the fantasy vein, we have another fantasy series, though this one is definitely much darker in tone, and it's historical fantasy, Ordinary Monsters, and the sequel, Bringer of Dust. I've been wanting to read this for ages. I've had it on my shelf mocking me, so I definitely need to pick it up. Ordinary Monsters was also a 5-star read, a favorite in my top 10 favorite fantasy reads, along with Legends and Lattes, so I have a good feeling about the sequel. So next up, I have another series that does have a fantastical element to it, but I would definitely classify it more as historical fiction, and that is the series that starts with The Shadow of the Wind by Carlos Ruiz Zafón. We also have The Angel's Game. Both of these I gave 5 stars. And then book 3 in the series is The Prisoner of Heaven. So I'm excited to pick this up. I have been loving this series so far. I'm excited to read on in it. It has great dark academia, sort of film noir kind of vibes, set in mid-century Barcelona. So very excited to read on. I have one more option in the fantasy genre, which is the series of novellas by Niveau that starts with The Empress of Salt and Fortune. The Empress of Salt and Fortune I gave 5 stars. And then the second novella in the series, which is I think The Tiger Came Down the Mountain, that one I gave 4 stars. So I'm still counting it because the first book got 5 stars, but I am curious to pick up the third novella in the series, which is Into the Riverlands. So that's an option for this video, and a much shorter option than all the other books here. And then I have 2 sci-fi options. So the first one is the series that starts with The House of Styx by Derek Kunkskin. This is a book that I actually had as an e-arc, and I loved it. And I do not hear enough people talk about this book. I feel like it didn't get that much marketing. It's not really widely known online, I don't think. And it's a really cool sci-fi story about a colony of humans that have moved to Venus, but they can't live on the surface of Venus because it's too toxic. So they live in the atmosphere, and it follows one particular family who live on a ship far down in the atmosphere where it's quite toxic, and there's a bit of mystery, there's complicated family dynamics. It's really good, okay? It's really good. But I'm very excited to read on in the series with book 2, which is The House of Saints. This book has a little bit of a mystery quality. They've discovered something on the surface of Venus, and they're not quite sure what it means. So I'm so excited to read on in the series. I feel like we're gonna get some really awesome reveals, and I just wanna hang out with these characters again because I really connected to them. And then my second sci-fi option, and my last potential read for this video, is another series that some people define as being fantasy and some define as being sci-fi. It's sort of nebulous speculative fiction, but that is the series that starts with Gideon the Ninth and then Harrow the Ninth. I read the first and second books this past year and gave both of them 5 stars, and I'm very excited to read book 3 in the series, Nona the Ninth. I've been trying to save it because I believe there's going to be one last book in the series, and I kind of wanted to save Nona the Ninth so I could read it and then the 4th book kind of back to back, because I know I'll want to know what happens next once I finish Nona, but I've been really struggling with waiting to read it, so we'll see. But those are all the options. Those are all the books I could read for this video. You know, I might regret this, but I think I want to start with Bringer of Dust. I only say that because it's so long, so I'm not going to get a quick, fast win as my first read of the video. But if I do get through this, then any other book I pick is going to go like that. It's going to be such a quick read. So, and according to the front of this, this is meant to be a trilogy. So this is book 2 in a trilogy. Hopefully this book doesn't fall victim to the second book slump thing that happens in a lot of, especially fantasy trilogies. I feel like the second books are often a bridge between book 1 and book 2 and not as complete in its own arc. Hopefully that won't happen. I mean, the first book was fantastic. Amazing. So I have a lot of hope and a lot of trust in J.M. Miro to do a great job with book 2, but I've been burned before by second books in a trilogy, so maybe that's part of why I'm so bad at continuing on in series. I've been disappointed too many times, but I am sure that this won't be one of those times. Well, I just got to the halfway point of Bringer of Dust. I'm not okay. Oh my god. I'm not okay. I feel like up until a couple chapters before the halfway point, I was enjoying it. I, had some thoughts to share, but I was kind of feeling like it was maybe going a bit slower than the first book from what I remembered, or maybe I was just struggling with focusing on some different characters than the ones that were the main focus in book one. Things happened at the end of book one that I'm not going to talk about for spoiler reasons until the spoiler section at least, and that has kind of shifted where we are and what we're doing and which characters we're focusing on. There are also some brand new characters in this book that weren't in the first book. And I do find the new characters interesting, but I'm definitely struggling with wanting to spend more time with the characters that I already know and love and wanting to check in with them and feeling like the bits that we're getting from them is just not enough for me. So that's a bit of a challenge. And that was kind of my main feeling up until a couple chapters ago. And now my brain hurts and also my heart hurts because of what happened in the last couple chapters, which again, I can't talk about for spoiler reasons, but damn, I'm sad. I feel like making this a story written for adults, but where most of the characters are quite young, either literal children or teenagers, it's really pulling on my heartstrings and really making me feel so much more strongly for them, especially because these books are extremely violent and gory and bloody. Not only bad, terrible, very violent things happening to children, but also children being the ones doing the very bad, violent bloody things. It's really hard to read. Oh my god. It is very good. It's very interesting. It's a pretty long book, right? And I'm 300 pages in and it's gone by like that. Whenever I sit down to read, I'm just totally pulled in. It feels very immersive, something nostalgic about it. And I really appreciate how descriptive it is, and not just of locations so that I can actually envision where they are, but also of what the magic looks like, and pretty thorough descriptions of what every character looks like, the expression that's in their eyes and the way they hold their mouth, and just all those little details that help build a character for me. I want to be able to see in my mind's eye what's happening, and I really appreciate how detailed J.M. Miro is in that area. Most of the new characters are just really terrible people, like mass murderers, kind of terrible people. Having a little bit of trouble with that. I find them interesting. The characters are interesting. I'm having trouble rooting for them. So I just keep wanting to get back to our characters. I am loving the deepening of the characterization for Carolyn Fink, who is an older woman, the alchemist, who is an exile from Cairndale because she lost her talent. And she was a very minor character from what I remember in the first book, but she has become a much more prominent character in this book, and I'm just loving her. She is so sweet and lovely. I'm really enjoying the way that her relationship with a prominent character, I would say really the protagonist of this book so far, which I am loving, and they are developing a much deeper relationship with Carolyn, and I'm really liking that. It's really sweet. They've had some really touching conversations back and forth. And actually there was one quote, one thing that Carolyn said, which resonated very deeply to me. And she has an accent, so it's written to suit her accent, which I'm not going to try to imitate, so bear with me. But I'll tell you a secret, she said gently. There aren't any grown-ups, redacted name, not in the way you mean it. There's only just children what's gone and got too far away from their own childhoods. Sure, their bodies is all grown, but on the inside, everyone's all just about the same size. Which, relatable, because I often feel like in many ways, I feel younger now than I did when I was actually a child or a teenager. I feel like I was treated like and felt like I was an old soul as a kid and a teenager, and felt like I was, mature beyond my years. And now that I am in my 30s, I feel like I'm a kid. I have no idea what I'm doing. So very relatable. And then earlier, higher up on that page, the child she's talking to says, it was like he saw something in me, something good. And because he saw it, I could see it too. I don't know. I didn't used to know how important that is. Being seen, which made me sad. So anyway, I'm really enjoying the deepening of their relationship. It's really sweet. And I'm definitely engaged in the plot. And, it's continuing on directly from the plot of the first book. So there was a bit of not really a cliffhanger. Well, yeah, a cliffhanger at the end of the first book where we don't really know how they're going to fix this issue. And one of the kids is in a dangerous situation and the other kids are going to have to try to save them, and I'm definitely invested in how they're going to solve that, although I know this is book 2 of a trilogy, so I don't know if they'll actually solve that overarching dilemma in this book or if that's going to happen in the third book. I kind of hope we make at least a little bit more progress in this book than we have already, but it is very heartbreaking, just like all the kids dealing with their grief in different ways. And this series really pulls on my heartstrings in just so many ways. And this one also, from what I remember, the first book was also pretty violent and gory. I think I was kind of surprised by just how bloody and gory it was. But this book, I feel, has more body horror. Unless I've just blocked out some of it from the first book, which is definitely possible. But in the last chapter that I read, getting to the halfway point, there was some just disturbing level body horror that was kind of shocking to read. So yeah, just keep that in mind if you're thinking about reading the series. It is very dark, very bloody and gory, not for the faint of heart. Okay, I'm going to do a super quick spoiler section for anyone who has read ideally both the first book and this book, and then I'll go finish this. So spoilers now for the first half of Bringer of Dust and all of Ordinary Monsters. So the character who I would call the protagonist of this book is Charlie, and I am really glad because I loved Charlie in the first book. I especially loved Charlie and Marlowe's friendship, almost brotherhood level connection, and obviously at the end of the first book, Marlowe is trapped in that other world and they don't know if they're going to be able to save him, and so Charlie is now back in our world, feeling that loss really keenly because Marlowe became his family, and he knows, as much as he can't remember all the details of what happened on the other side, he knows that he was there with Marlowe and had to leave him behind. So he feels this huge amount of regret and guilt and this responsibility to save him by whatever means possible. And he and Carolyn are together along with the glyph twisted children who she's been caring for. And their relationship is just developing in such a beautiful way, and the way that she's mothering him is really sweet, and it just is making me emotional for him to have even more of like a familial care in his life, especially now that he's without Marlowe. So I'm really loving that. I am really worried about Charlie because his body ended up bonding basically with some of the dust that was in Jacob Marber that turned him evil and connected him to the Druger. And Charlie is terrified of it, and Carolyn tried to cut it out of him basically, and they couldn't get any more than a tiny bit out. So much of these books is looking into what it means to be a monster, how we define what a monster is, and where that line is. Is it our actions that make us a monster? Is it nature? Is it nurture? Is it behavior? Is it how we feel about the choices we make? And I'm really worried that Charlie is going to turn into a monster in an unambiguous way because of the dust, and not even it being him doing monstrous things, but the dust using him for monstrous ends, basically. And I really don't want that for Charlie, so I'm nervous about that. I'm also struggling with Marlowe, who we are seeing occasionally basically like a spirit, and he seems completely changed and tainted by the other world. If it's even him, who knows? Maybe it's the Druger or something else, like using his form to manipulate people, but it seems like he is losing himself, turning into a monster in a pretty creepy and unsettling way. So that's also stressing me out. And all the glyph twisted children who I was really getting attached to, and who Carolyn cared for so deeply and her brother cared for so deeply. I think all of them but one just died at the end of the last chapter I read, which is heartbreaking. I was just kind of in shock reading it. I'm really hoping that there's some sort of twist and they aren't all dead. The implication seems to be that they are now all dead, with the exception of one who stayed behind, and that is absolutely heartbreaking. Clakerjack, the way he died of basically just imploding in on himself and then a hole opening in the middle of his body as the rest of his body crumpled inward, showing a mirror or a window into the other world, and you can see all the Drugurd looking back at them through this window as his body implodes in on itself and then explodes, was horrifying to read. Just the description was so unsettling and terrifying. These kids that we're introduced to, there's Jeddah, who regularly murders people by just breaking their necks using her bone magic. But then there's also these 3 kids who just go around brutally and bloodily murdering people, and Micah, at the end of every time they murder someone, cuts off their ear to take as a trophy. So that's unsettling. I do wish we were seeing more of the other kids. I'm really missing the presence of Ribs and Kamiko and Oscar. We've seen each of them for at least a brief moment, but they're really in the background of this book. And I mean, who knows? Again, I'm halfway through, so maybe in the second half they'll reunite. Yeah, it's intense. There's a lot. I'm feeling emotionally drained after that last chapter, to be honest. We're mostly meeting new characters and developing them and then killing them off so far. Clakerjack, Jeddah, Micah, and his little sisters. Out of those 5 new characters, we spent a lot of time with them. And Ruth, so 6. All of them but Micah are now dead. And all of them but Ruth died in just the last chapter. So I don't really know where we go from here. I guess maybe we go back to focusing on characters from the first book, which I wouldn't mind. It'll be interesting to see where it goes from here. It's kind of hard to give, I mean, I'm halfway through, so this isn't a definitive review, but it's hard to talk about it because it really feels like I'm just in the very middle of everything, which I literally am. So I think I'll stop talking and go finish this so I can give you a proper review. So that's it for spoilers, and that is it for this mid-book update for Bringer of Dust. I'm interested in seeing what happens next. I'm excited. I'm also very nervous, but I am excited. So I'll be back when I finish it. Goodbye. Hey, so I finished Bringer of Dust, and basically I really enjoyed this. I'm still enjoying the series quite a bit. I'm definitely going to read the 3rd and final book in the trilogy, but I will say that the second book didn't hit quite as hard as book 1. I wasn't quite as wholeheartedly in love with it for a variety of reasons that I'll get into. So I think I'm sitting around 4 stars for this. I really liked it, but I did have some, not even really criticisms. Well, one criticism, I guess, but mostly not really criticisms, just I wasn't quite as taken or quite as engrossed with the story and with the characters that we're focused on in this book as I was in book 1. I think I mentioned this in the first update, but we're following a lot of the same characters from book 1, but because they're each off doing their own thing in different parts of the world, we only get, a chapter with this character here and then a chapter with this character there, and they spend very little time together. So things are a little bit more fragmented. We don't get as much time with the characters that we grew to love in book 1. And in addition to that, there are several new characters introduced, and they do get quite a bit of page time. So I think how much people enjoy this book, and this also applies to me, is going to kind of come down to how you feel about the new characters, how interested you are in them, how engaged you are with their stories, and whether or not you're super disappointed to get less of that found family dynamic of all of the characters from the first book together. If you're more interested in the characters individually and don't mind just little vignettes, in that case, I think you'll really enjoy this book because it does still have that really beautiful descriptive writing style. It has has a very evocative historical setting. The magic system is still incredibly fascinating. I feel like in this book we got a lot more history of the magic and of what the talents are and how they came to be, and a bit more lore, which I found really interesting and was really gobbling up. But I also struggled with the fact that pretty much every new character that was introduced is pretty unequivocally terrible and evil. I liked that in the first book there was this constant push and pull with the idea of what makes us a human and what makes a monster. Is it our actions that make us a monster? Does our nature automatically assign us to the role of monster? Can we sort of rise above our nature to choose not to be monstrous? Are you automatically a monster if you are capable of great violence and use that capacity when needed in self-defense? There were a lot of questions of that in the first book, and I loved the way it was sort of woven throughout the story and through each of the different characters' experiences with their talents. But in this book, while that's still a theme, and it continued to come up maybe even more explicitly in the text than it did in the first book, I at times felt that it was more on the nose, a little less subtle and nuanced than the way that the theme was explored in the first book. I struggled a bit with it because so many of the characters, basically all the new characters, are pretty, obviously terrible, and I would call them a monster without really wrestling with myself over it. And some of the characters we're following from book one have become more monstrous or are making more questionable, harmful, violent, murderous decisions in this book. So it just felt overall like there was more of an overt spelling out of this theme of what makes a monster and whether we can rise above our natures. But the actual character development and the plot felt a lot less nuanced and didn't seem to serve the theme quite as effectively as the character arcs and the plot in book one, where there was just a lot more gray area. So I struggled a bit with that. And as much as I'm not necessarily anti-violence in the books I read a lot of books that have violence, and I think that's largely fine. I did at times struggle with the excess of violence in this book. It at times felt more for shock value than for serving the story. And I didn't feel that in book one, though I was shocked by it. It didn't feel like the whole purpose was shock value. And again, that's going to be largely interpretation based, and that's how I read it and my feelings about it, and someone else might feel completely differently about how the violence was handled. There were a couple moments that I was sort of wondering why a character would need to be introduced only to be brutally murdered on the same page, for example. Those kinds of things happened a few too many times for my own personal taste. But yeah, one more thing, non-spoiler, I won't say who the character is, but there is a character introduced who is largely considered to be evil, but she's described as being huge and monstrous. She's 6'5", which yes, is very tall for a woman, especially at the time that this is set, even though there are magical creatures, but okay. She's very tall, but just constantly described as huge and monstrous and gigantic and, terrifying. And I just found it a little off-putting the number of times she was described as being tall, and that was a shorthand for the fact that she was evil. For obvious reasons. I don't love that. There's not a huge amount of body diversity in this book, as far as I can tell, in heights or sizes in general. And the fact that the one female character who's described as genuinely taller than average, that is just a sign that she is the absolute worst, is not my favorite thing as a tall woman myself. As much as this second book wasn't as much of an all-time favorite as book one, it was still fantastic, and part of the reason why I'm being a little harder on it, a little more critical, is because I'm comparing it to the greatness that was the first book. The first book was a just masterful, incredible, fantastic piece of fantasy fiction, and so for this to follow it up and to do so well is a testament to the author's talent, but also, it's hard to follow up such a great book with anything and for it to live up to the expectations set by the first book. And this one did struggle a little bit, but again, it's still absolutely fantastic. 4 stars for me is a really great rating. So I am going to quickly talk about spoilers. So these are spoilers for the entirety of this book, but also the entirety of book one. The fact that as I did my half book update, Jeddah had just died, or I thought she just died, and then literally the first sentence, I think, of the next chapter, which I had not even looked across the page to skim, it shows that Jeddah actually didn't die. So sometimes I wish that I would just let myself spoil myself in a couple sentences before I film an entire update. I do think Jed is an interesting character, and I am curious to see how her dynamic with the group grows, because she's sort of pulled into the group and accepted into the group, at least on a temporary basis at the end of this book, and she works to help them. I still struggle to trust her because she has not proven herself to be particularly trustworthy. She's killed a lot of people, and she also seems, not that this is her fault, but she seems very, very, very motivated by approval and acceptance, especially from a sort of parental type authority figure. So I do feel concerned that she will be very easily manipulated into betraying our amazing, lovely family of characters because she has this deep need for this parental love and approval, and she keeps not getting it. And as much as she seems to be loving the idea of finally having friends for the first time, I'm not sure that that's strong enough to outweigh this really deep need that she has, this unmet need. I am, of course, very glad that Marlowe was rescued at the end by Charlie. I'm surprised, though, because I was not quite as emotional as I expected to be when they finally were together and hugged. I did get a little emotional, but I expected to be sobbing like a little baby. I sobbed at the end of the first book when they were separated, and I just didn't feel quite as much emotion for them and their relationship. Maybe it was just a bit rushed. It was a very quick scene at the end of a very long, relatively slower paced book, and so maybe it just went by too fast for me to really feel it, or maybe I was just in a weird headspace. I don't know, but I did get emotional when Edward wrote Carolyn a letter to update her on how he's doing and the fact that he misses her. That made me cry. So I don't know. I'm trying to not be too hard on the book because maybe it's not the book's fault, but it did feel a little bit rushed, and it didn't feel quite as emotional and cathartic to have that reunion as I expected it to be. I do find the development of Charlie as a character really interesting, and I loved that he was more focused on in this book. I find him to be a really fascinating character. He has this self-awareness and this concern about his capacity for violence, and having the dust from Jacob Marber incorporate with him in this book, and that both amplifying his talent and his power, but also creating this sense of being almost possessed in a way, and that causing him concern that not only it will give him the strength and the power to do greater harm than he could already, but also that he will maybe not even choose to do the harm, but the dust will use his body for it, and he will become just a vessel for evil. I think that's really interesting, and also tying in with Komako's story and the way that she finds that sometimes her power sort of seems to make choices without her, or she doesn't feel like she's making conscious choices, especially in the first book, turning her sister into a lich, and then in the second book, turning a whole horde, a whole group of children who were killed by a Druger into liches in a moment of rage without really even seemingly consciously making that decision. And it is interesting. I wish we'd had a bit more time. I did feel like the ending was a bit rushed in general, because I wanted a little bit more from how the other characters felt about that decision, and her being able to explain that they were already dead, and this was sort of a instinctual reaction to kind of bring them back. I guess we got a brief moment of that when Marlowe comes home, and he does go to see her, want to see her and hug her, and also talk to and hug and sort of acknowledge the other children, even though now they're liches. So there was a bit of that, but I did find it a bit odd that she didn't even seem to try at all to explain what happened, and no one else seemed to try to understand her side. Anyways, I just thought that was a bit odd, and I did find that was one of those moments, just the fact that all the children are just murdered now in an instant. I struggled with that a little bit. I didn't know why that needed to happen, and maybe in the third book it'll make sense narratively why it needed to happen. I also found the scene with them finding the first talent in a room, and he has no eyes and no tongue, and he's just sort of like tied up here, and Dr. Berghast starts to try to kill him, and he overpowers him and takes the parts that he needs from Dr. Berghast and puts them in himself, was lots of body horror in this one. That scene didn't necessarily feel overly gory as much as it's very gory. It felt like it made sense for what was happening, and it felt like it fit in the tone, I guess, of the story, but it was a lot. It was intense. I still loved Marlowe. There were a few moments where I got really choked up of him sort of just being there alone as a little kid. There was one moment where before he was found by Dr. Berghast, he's just by himself, and the narrator talks about him holding his own hand or putting his own hand in his other hand and pretending that it was Charlie holding his hand because he's so lonely. And I was just like, oh my God, someone give this kid a hug. But yeah, obviously I have a few more critiques of this one than the first book, and it wasn't quite as top tier for me, but it was still fantastic. I'm still giving it 4 stars. I still loved it. I still cried at times, and I'm definitely really looking forward to the 3rd book in the trilogy and seeing where everything wraps up. And I would definitely still recommend this series based on the first 2 books. Again, as long as you are able to handle gore and violence and blood, because there's a lot of it. And those are all my thoughts for Bringer of Dust. So 4 stars from me. Not too bad of a start for this video. Unfortunately, this has cemented this video as being less successful than the first time I did my reading sequels of books I loved video, because in that video, every book I read got 5 stars. Spoilers. And already we are 1 for 1 not getting 5 stars, but this was a fantastic read. I still had a great time with it. I don't think it's a failure of a book or of the video so far, but I do hope we'll at least get a couple 5-star reads in this video. What am I gonna read next? I kind of want to mix it up. We obviously just read fantasy, so I kind of want to move to something a little bit more on the sci-fi side of things. And I think, honestly, I think it would be fun. I'm kind of drawn to reading The House of Saints. So I think I'm gonna do that. I'm very excited to read this. Honestly, I read the first book so long ago that I feel like a lot of the details have escaped me, but I still remember so much of the vibes and of the characters and of the sort of overarching mystery that was happening. So hopefully I'll be able to kind of hop in without too much trouble, but I'm really excited to get started on this one. And hopefully I love it and give it 5 stars, because I want a 5-star read for this video. So I'm gonna go do that. I'm gonna go start this, and I'll be back when I get to 50%. I'm back. I got to the halfway point of The House of Saints, and I'm loving this. I'm having such a good time. It's so funny because I read the first book years ago, and obviously I remembered that I loved it. And I remembered, you know, different aspects of why the story really appealed to me, like the unique setting and the hard sci-fi feel, but with really well-developed characters, the heart of the stories and the relationships. But I didn't remember a lot of little details. I didn't really remember what the writing style was like. So it was kind of fun to ease my way into the second book and be reminded of the style, the storytelling. And I'm just so pleasantly surprised to be reminded that the writing is beautiful. It's not overly flowery. I wouldn't even say it's lyrical necessarily. It is pretty straightforward, almost stark, but it also has this sort of understated beauty to it, and it is quite poetic at the same time. Literally poetry, because one of the characters writes poetry, so sometimes some of his poems are included, but also there's just, especially in the way the characters talk about and describe Venus, there's so much beauty, there is so much poetry, living in, languishing in the awe of such a gorgeous sight. Yet it sort of has found that balance because it really doesn't feel overwritten or overly flowery by any means. It's quite lovely. And I still feel the same way I did about the first book, which is that the setting that this colony is living in the atmosphere above Venus, that feels very unique to me. Maybe there are lots of sci-fi stories that take place on Venus or in the atmosphere of Venus. I have not read any of them, so to me this is very different. I also love, like I said, the characterization, that the characters and the relationships are the heart of this story. I love these characters, and I very quickly remembered why I loved them so much. They all feel very nuanced, complex, real, grounded. They're vulnerable. They have flaws. They all have their own past hurts and wounds, their grief that they're working through, and they all work through it in different ways. And they all want love, but they express that in different ways. And it just feels very realistic for the kind of complicated familial relationships that you can have. There are so many different ways that we can interact with our family and the different sort of versions of ourselves that we put forward with different people in our lives. I'm going to hold off talking too much about the characters because, again, I'm trying to not only not spoil this book, but also the first book. And there are quite a few reveals about different characters or character deaths that happen at the end of the first book and also in this book so far, and I really don't want to spoil it. But I do love the characters, and I love Pascal most of all. I remember the first book talked a little bit about sort of estranged familial relationships and a little bit about grief and different ways of coping with that grief, and also sort of unhealthy or toxic coping mechanisms. And this book is also in that same realm, but I do feel, at least from what I remember, that this book is being a little bit more overt in its exploration of the themes when it comes to grief. And I think it's doing it in a really beautiful way. There was one particular chapter where I just highlighted almost every single sentence, and I was sobbing while I was reading it. It was almost word for word a conversation I had with my husband maybe 2 weeks ago about grief. So I'm really appreciating the exploration of grief. It feels very true to my experiences. And again, I really like that the author is showing how each character deals with their grief differently based on who they are, their personality, but also, you know, where they are in life, their responsibilities, the other things that they're dealing with, the other things weighing on their mind, and how those things, and also the types of relationships they have available to them and the types of support they have access to, changes how they cope with their grief or how they contextualize it. And again, that just feels very realistic, and it feels very vulnerable and emotionally honest, I guess. Also, not new to this book, but I love, love, love that this colony is made up of almost entirely Québécois, and that their francophone Québécois culture is so baked into the new culture that is growing on Venus. I also love how deep Kunskin is getting into developing the ways that they would grow to almost revere Venus as a dangerous, angry god in living in its atmosphere. Like, they live there by Venus's grace, and Venus is capricious, Venus is easily angered and will kill them at the slightest provocation, and that they're sort of walking this tightrope, and that dynamic, because it is so dangerous to live there, has turned into religions and fairy tales and mysticism and superstitions, and just really infiltrated the fabric of their lives in a way that feels realistic. And I think a lot of fantasy and sci-fi can do that sometimes, where the author doesn't necessarily take into account how much of an impact a different setting or a different religion would have on a group of people, or a technology, or a type of magic. And in this case, it feels like the fact that this is set on Venus or in the atmosphere of Venus has had a profound and inescapable impact on these characters and on the culture and on the colony. So I love that, and I do love the Québécois cultural influences. I love the sprinklings of French throughout. I love that they all swear in French. And I also love, you know, the implication is that they're speaking French 99% of the time, but obviously it's written in English. From time to time, you'll have someone respond oui or d'accord, and it just feels very genuine to my experience. I have family who are Francophone, Québécois, and there's a lot of Franglish going on, a lot of switching between the languages, but it feels very authentic. But yeah, I love this. I feel like It maybe has a slightly slower pace than a lot of sort of adventurous hard sci-fi because it does have more of a character-driven, relationship-based storytelling style, which I personally absolutely love, but I could see some people finding it a bit slow or a bit boring. But especially near the middle of the book, it's really picking up. There's more plot happening, there's more adventure, there's more intrigue, political intrigue, alliances, danger, scientific discovery, all kinds of exciting common sci-fi trappings, I guess, but I'm loving them. I'm finding them really interesting. And I feel like from what I remember, the first book was similar, where the first maybe half to 3/4 was slower, more developing the relationships and the characters, and then the last half to last quarter was pretty fast-paced, adventurous, exciting discoveries, science, politics, just all of that fun stuff. So it feels like maybe this book is following a similar path, and I definitely don't mind that. I didn't find it boring or slow to get through it all. I actually kind of sped through it and was really loving it and didn't want to stop. I actually read one chapter past 50% and then I forced myself to stop because I really wanted to just keep going to the end. So, oh, also, I'm not going to say which character it is because I don't want to spoil it because that's a discovery that sort of builds in the first book, but there is a trans character in this story and I'm really, really loving how her story is being explored. It feels very thoughtful and compassionate, the representation. She's discovered this huge part of her identity and, you know, this final piece has sort of clicked into place and it's explained so much about herself and about her life. And in this one sense, she feels this euphoria of finally having this discovery and understanding herself better. But then she also has the terror and the confusion and the struggle of having to now come out to everyone she loves and hope that they will accept her for who she is. And that is terrifying and so difficult. And it's been heartbreaking, but also beautiful. And I can't speak to the representation firsthand. I wish this series was more widely read so I could hear some perspectives from trans readers, how they feel the representation is done. But to me, as a cis person who is an ally and loves the trans community and is in full support of trans people finding their joy and finding the gloriousness of gender euphoria and getting to live the way that they were always meant to and feel that joy and the comfort and the rightness. I'm gonna get emotional. I just feel like it's a really beautiful representation so far, and I'm hoping it continues, obviously, but I'm really enjoying her story. So it feels like it has a lot of heart and feels very genuine. So those are all my non-spoilery thoughts. I'm having a great time. I will do a quick spoiler section, so maybe skip this if you haven't read the first book and also the second book, because I'm going to be spoiling all the way to the 50% mark, so maybe skip it. Okay, spoilers. So Pascal is the trans character, and I love her. Like I said, she's my favorite character. I love her so much. I'm really loving her story, and I'm heartbroken because she and Gabriel Antoine fell in love at the end of the first book, but they sort of fell in love before she realized who she was, and she just came out to him. He's very confused because he has always seen himself to be gay and only attracted to other men. So he's struggling with that, and they both feel heartbroken, and he doesn't understand why she can't just keep things the same and not change so they can be happy. And she is trying to express to him in any way she can that she has always been this person. She has always been a girl, and she has only just figured it out, and she can't pretend to be someone she isn't, even though she loves him. And it's absolutely devastating. I do feel by the halfway point that we're making some progress, and maybe there's a chance that they can figure out a way to be happy together, or at least to, stay in each other's lives and love each other, maybe in a more platonic way if they can't continue in a sort of romantic or sexual relationship. But I just want them to be happy together because they were so sweet, and I was so happy for them at the end of the first book, and then to watch it fall apart and for both of them to be so devastated, it's absolutely heartbreaking. And oh God, so that whole plot line has made me cry multiple times already, and I just love Pascal so much. And I love getting to see little moments of her trans joy and her gender euphoria. It's really, really nice. Like her growing her hair longer and feeling more feminine. It's just, oh my God, I'm gonna get emotional again. I love her. And starting this one and them talking about Marthe dying at the end of the first book, I was really hoping that it was one of those things of like, well, we never found the body, so, she's gonna pop back up and she'll be fine. And I kept holding on to that for a ridiculous amount of time before I realized, no, I'm pretty sure she just actually died. And maybe that was very clear in the first book, and it was just that I took such a long break between them that I didn't remember. But I hate that because I loved Marthe and I really don't want her to be dead. It's not fair. And then in the last chapter, I read one more chapter before doing this update, and throughout the first half of the book, I was really growing to love Marie-Pierre and how motherly she was, and the fact that she was spending a ridiculous amount of money to try to get hormones for Pascal to help her and keep her secret and be supportive in that way. And she just died horribly. Like, she and Emile were arrested, put into an airlock, and then they opened the airlock and let them suffocate and freeze to death. And Emile just barely managed to escape, but he didn't have the strength to carry Marie-Pierre with him, and she'd already passed out, and she's dead now. And I hate that because she was great. Why? I am struggling with the fact so far that all the characters who are dying are women. Like, it was Georges Etienne's wife, who died before the first book started, and Chloé, who also died before the first book started. And then at the end of the last book, Marthe died. And then in this book, halfway through, Marie-Pierre died. The only women we have left, we have Pascal, and that's it. Is Pascal gonna die? I'm not gonna be okay if Pascal is killed off because she's my favorite and she's the main character basically. So no. I will be so angry. Pretty much no other, there are new female characters, and there are female characters like the Présidente, and there are like Fabienne and some people from other families, and Victoire, I guess, who are sort of competing with the House of Styx, but they're not as prominent as, the Daquillon family. So I would like the women to stop dying now, please. Good Lord. I love that Emile finally realized that Thérèse is the absolute worst. She was his sort of on again, off again sort of girlfriend in the first book, and she's so high on her own supply and like holier than thou. And Emile is a bit of a mess sometimes, but he has a good heart and he's caring. And I feel like this book is doing a great job of showing how awesome of an older brother kind of figure he is and how much he loves indulging kids, even though he has this sort of like grumpy exterior. He does kind of love fulfilling that big brother role. The whole first book, he's just chasing after Thérèse, trying to prove that he has an artist's soul. And she's so like woo-woo, obsessed with the goddess Venus, leading this cult essentially, or like new age religion. And she's just kind of the worst. And I'm really appreciating that it seems like he's finally over it because she's not worth his time. And I really want, it seems from that last chapter, that Emile is going to fly down the Cosapscal de Profondeur and be with his family and help them out. I'm excited for maybe a reunion between him and his father, for them to finally sort of hammer out their issues, and for him to be there to be big brother to Pascal, because he's talked already quite a bit about how much he loved being a big brother to a little sister of Marthe and Chloé, and now he can be there as a big brother to Pascal, his new little sister, and be there for her. And I'm excited for that. Also, I love the passages talking about this wormhole they found basically in the first book. If you're watching this, even though you have no intention of reading this, maybe you're not a sci-fi person, and in that case, okay, fine, I get it. Although I still think this is great, and even non-sci-fi people, well, no, maybe non-sci-fi people won't like it. It is kind of hard sci-fi. Anyway, at the end of the first book, they discover, or partway through the first book, they discover basically a wormhole in a cave sort of just under the surface of Venus. And in this second book so far, they've been building the technology they need to basically set up camp there and to be able to travel through the wormhole and see what's on the other side. And all of the passages of Pascal and Gabriel Antoine traveling through the wormhole and seeing what's on the other side have been absolutely beautiful, just the way they're described, but it just is so vivid, it's so evocative, you really feel like you're there, and it's awe-inspiring and beautiful. So I'm loving those passages, and I'm excited to see where it goes, because I feel like people are going to find out about it, and there's going to be quite a battle for control, because it's such a valuable resource, which ideally should be shared amongst all the colonists to make their colony better and safer and more sustainable and all that stuff. But I have a feeling that the bank or the government are going to try to take over and kind of cut out the House of Styx, but also all of the coureurs from the deal. So we'll see what happens. But loving this so far, having a great time, and I'm very excited to go finish it. So those are the spoilers. That is it for this update, and I'll be back when I'm done. Hello, I'm back and I finished The House of Saints, and I'm excited to share a final wrap up on this one. I really liked this. I'm not surprised. I feel like it was obvious probably from my mid-book update as well that I was still enjoying this series as much as I did in the first book. And honestly, I have very little criticism to give this. I feel like it was really fantastic. My biggest complaint is really just that I wanted more. I kind of feel like this could have easily been a trilogy and maybe would have benefited from being a trilogy, just because I felt like the pacing was at a really nice, slow, consistent pace up until 3/4 of the way through or so, and then it really picked up and it was a little bit fast for me. It felt a touch rushed, and I just kind of felt like I wanted more time with the characters. I wanted more time with the resolution. I feel like if the first 3/4 of this book had been its own book, and then a book 3 had explored the last quarter, and then a little bit of what we got in the epilogue, that would have been absolutely perfect for me, because I just wanted more. I really liked this. I definitely have some sort of nitpicky things about the ending that I maybe would have wanted to be different in an ideal world if I were in charge of what happened and who gets to live or die. But regardless, I thought this was really fantastic. I think this is an amazing hard sci-fi series, hard sci-fi duology. If you are looking for more hard sci-fi, please check this out. I just love how unique the setting is here. Exploring life on Venus, but doing it in a way that feels actually well thought out and logical and tailored to the reality of Venus, without sort of falling into maybe a common trope in a lot of sci-fi that I've read where, we can just imagine science so advanced that all the problems of a toxic atmosphere or extreme heat or whatever is kind of waved away, either because they have these really advanced habitats that protect them, or because they just terraform a planet and tailor it to their biology. In this case, sure, they're more advanced than our technology, for sure, but so much of it is sort of imagining technology that would have been grown out of or built from Venus itself and based on the resources of Venus. And it feels a lot more, I'm not an expert, I'm not an engineer, I don't know how much of this is accurate or plausible in terms of sci-fi science, but it felt very well thought out and very creative in some of the ways that Kongskin tried to address the issues. And I just really liked this idea of a much earlier stage in the colonization of a new planet, where the colony doesn't have a huge amount of money, they aren't really well established, they don't have all the resources they need, they haven't necessarily figured out all the challenges and problems. It's a small colony still trying to make it work and find a way to survive, and still sort of on the precipice of total failure. And I just think that's a really fascinating stage of development. Again, I feel like so much sci-fi is either the initial contact, first contact or first landing on a new planet or a moon, or it's a very established colony with that really advanced technology. And this was that middle transitional stage. And I just found it so fascinating. And I do think it sort of reflects and ties in with some of the larger themes with the trans character in this story who is going through her transition and discovering herself and growing into the fullest version of herself, learning to accept herself, coming out to the people she loves and having them accept her for the person she has always been. I just feel like that piece of the story and that the character heart of the story is really beautifully mirrored by that sort of transitional period and that growth period, that coming of age of the colony itself. Maybe I'm getting too heady about it and overanalyzing it and being too saccharine, I don't know, but I just thought it was beautiful. I love the writing. It is so gorgeous. My goodness. I love the characters. Part of why I struggled with the ending is that some characters I really love died. And while I think it's realistic for characters to die, and I loved that it was really reinforced constantly how dangerous of an environment this is and how difficult it is for humans to survive in this environment, despite everything that they have learned, despite all the checks and balances, despite the technology they've developed, it's still an incredibly hostile environment, and it is very easy to die. And that loss and that grief is ever present throughout the book. Not in a way, I wouldn't say that it makes the book super morose necessarily, but I did feel like the examination of grief and how different characters react to their grief and how they process it, how they cope with it, how they contextualize it and discuss it. I just found it really beautiful. Like I said in the first update, I read passages to my husband crying because I just had to share it. I just thought that was really gorgeous and really resonated with me. But I also really appreciated how the transition was handled and how the trans character was handled. I can't speak from personal experience how accurate it is, but I have seen at least one review from a trans reader who felt that this was a really beautiful, really compassionate, thoughtful, and realistic portrayal of what that early transition period is like. And that makes me really happy because I love the character so much, and it really felt very thoughtful and kind, nuanced. I'm feeling a bit emotional. I just thought it was gorgeous. Like I said, the ending was a bit hard because I wanted more time. I wanted some of the characters to not die. I just was feeling, every page that I turned as I got near the end, I was more and more aware that it was almost over, and I was not happy about it. So I almost gave it 4 stars because I felt frustrated by the fast pace of the end and wanting more. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that that's not really fair. And I do think it was good, and I do think it makes sense. And I don't think any of the deaths felt excessive or for shock value or, trying to emotionally manipulate the reader into feeling something. It all made sense, not only for the plot, but also for each character's individual arc. But that doesn't mean I wasn't sad about it, because I was. I'll talk about it more in the spoiler section about the individual deaths and how I felt about them. But we get 2 epilogues at the end that sort of tell us a little bit of what happens in the following decades, and I hope that the author comes back later and decides to write novels exploring that period in more detail. I feel like I do this so often where I complain that a series is too long and was dragged out too much, and then for standalones or a duology or something, I feel like it should have been more. There wasn't enough. Everything I said from the first half applies. Gorgeous writing, so much heart, amazing characters, really beautifully depicted, complex, nuanced, emotional relationships, beautiful handling of a trans character, really lovely inclusion of Quebecois culture, fascinating science, and a really unique setting, and to me, seemingly a very realistic and grounded portrayal of what this early stage would be on Venus. It's so evocative, you really feel like you're there, and that's one of my favorite things about sci-fi and fantasy, when I feel transported to another world, and I felt that so strongly reading both the first book and this one. Just this sense that I could smell and taste and feel and see all these different aspects of Venus, and that I was there experiencing it firsthand and feeling the wonder that the characters feel and the sort of awe and the respect. I loved the way that Venus as the planet was its own character, had become this legend or the goddess for them to pray to and respect because of her danger and her capacity for violence, and this idea that they are afraid of her and resent her and hate her for the people that she's taken from them, but they also are in so much awe. They're so inspired by her. They are beholden to her. They exist because she allows them to exist. And just the ways that even the characters who aren't really part of the maybe more literal cults that or religions that are growing that worship Venus, everyone has a bit of an aspect of a spiritual connection to Venus as a planet, and I just loved the way that that was incorporated. It felt so realistic for how human brains process situations we're thrust into, especially really harrowing, difficult, challenging living situations. Can you tell? I love this. I'm giving it 5 stars. I thought it was really great. Yeah, I cried quite a few times reading this, and while I do wish the ending had been given a little bit more time to breathe, or again, that we'd been given one more book in this series to really spread everything out, I just think this is beautifully done, and I want more people to read this duology. If you're a fan of sci-fi, read it, please. Not enough people are reading this. Not enough people are loving on it. And I will just continue to make it my mission to talk about it all the time and explain to people why they should read it. I'm honestly kicking myself. I almost put the first book of this duology on my top 10 sci-fi, and I was just going back and forth, and I ended up knocking it off my top 10, and I'm mad at myself, and I kind of wish that I could go back and put it back into my top 10 or have it as a bonus in the main video, because more people need to read this. Anyway, I feel like I'm starting to repeat myself a bit and rambles. So I'm going to end the non-spoiler section, 5 stars for the House of Saints. And I am going to do just a short spoiler section to talk about the ending and the fates of a variety of characters in a little more detail for those of you who have read this. Probably not that many of you yet, but hopefully lots of you are adding this duology to your TBR as I speak right now. So maybe you can come back and watch this later once you finish. So, spoilers for the House of Saints and, by extension, the House of Styx, starting now. The ending, oh my gosh. Okay, I liked it. It made sense. But I just wanted more. I wanted more. Everything was happening so quickly. So, okay. First of all, I feel like this keeps happening to me. I think this happened in Bringer of Dust too, where literally a few sentences into the next chapter after where I stopped for the mid-book update, I learned that Marie-Pierre actually hadn't died. So I complained in the spoiler section in the first half update that all the female characters were being killed off. And then it turns out that Marie-Pierre wasn't actually dead. So there's that. I was glad that she didn't die, but I did feel like she was a bit underutilized in the second half of the book, and she was such an interesting character, so I kind of wish we got more of her, not only just through the second half in general, but also especially at the end, because she's reunited with our main characters, but we don't really get to see them have that moment of coming back together and, you know, relief at all being okay. Like, we know it happened intellectually because we know that she was there talking to them and she ended up going into their ship to see them, but we didn't get to firsthand experience it. And I wanted that emotionally to kind of conclude the arc for the book, for her relationships with the various characters, especially Pascal. But then again, I was complaining that all the female characters were dying. Turns out that while Marthe actually was dead, Marie-Pierre wasn't. But then after that, in quick succession, we start losing male characters. They're dropping like flies. They get into this firefight and they end up killing Georges Etienne, who is the patriarch, the father. And Émile has arrived. He goes off to try to help Georges Etienne, and he also gets shot and dies. So they both die in the same battle. Pascal came out to him in a letter, but they didn't get to have even just one conversation face to face about who Pascal really is, and that really broke my heart. Especially because she never got to tell her father. So Georges Etienne died not knowing that he had one living daughter. Oh my God, I'm gonna cry. Like, he thought he'd lost all his daughters. And it turns out he still had a daughter, but he never got to know, and that broke my heart. I felt like that death made more sense, and in that moment it made sense for him, and I think his arc had kind of played itself out, not in a bad way, it just had come to its natural conclusion. But for Émile, I wish that he'd had a chance to go down with them to the planet and see the wormhole, but also have at least one proper conversation with Pascal. I felt like I needed that for him, and so I thought for sure he wasn't going to be dead, kind of like with Marthe. And when he didn't come back, I was like, wait, what? That's it? It felt so sudden to me. Then they all get down on the planet. The bank is getting closer to them. They've sort of figured out what's going on, and they are using their technology to try to get closer to the surface. And Gabriel Antoine and Pascal go out to, I think they're adjusting the radio tower to try to get better signal so they can reach out to other coureurs to try to get help. And Gabriel Antoine gets shot and it crushes his arm. Gabriel Antoine ends up passing away. I didn't necessarily feel like it was a shock value moment trying to force me to feel something by killing off a character, but it did feel a little too soon, again, for me. Kind of like Émile, where I felt like we needed at least one more chapter with him and one more conversation between him and Pascal, if not for him to survive, because I really liked Émile's character arc in the second book and his sort of redemption, and wanted him to stick around and be able to care for his family and be with his family. But for Gabriel Antoine, you know, the conflict through so much of this second book is that Pascal comes out to him and they really had never come to any kind of conclusion, and then Gabriel Antoine dies. And I think the last conversation they have, Gabriel Antoine is dreaming of a future for them together and happy, and he says, you know, and neither of us would ever change. And Pascal, you know, is hurt by that and says something along the lines of, my wish or my dream is that in your dream, in this version of reality, you could want the change as much as I do. And Gabriel Antoine says, yes, I wish I could want it too. And that did make me emotional, and it did feel somewhat of a, you know, it wasn't completely left open-ended. They did have this discussion, but I don't know what I wanted. I wanted there to be something. Obviously, what I really wanted was for them to figure it out and be happy and be together forever, because I wanted them to both be happy and not heartbroken. But I still kind of wanted a little bit more resolution. It just felt like he died kind of holding on to the idea that, I think he even said at one point, it doesn't really matter anymore because I'm not going to live very long. And so I'm not going to see you reach the end of your transition, basically. So I can just love you for the time I have left, and basically not contend with the reality of your gender. That both makes Pascal happy because she loves him and wants to have their last moments together, but she also is completely heartbroken by the fact that those last moments feel like a lie, on some level. And again, maybe that's a complicated, painful, heartbreaking, but realistic portrayal of something that could happen. It just, again, felt like a little bit too soon. I wanted them to have a little bit more time together. At least if Gabriel Antoine had to die, maybe they could have had 1 or 2 more chapters together to maybe come to some sort of resolution. And maybe that's not realistic because the timeline is pretty quick for him to come to terms with it and for them to figure that out. But I just, wanted it. So that's where I'm at with those characters, where I just kind of feel like it makes sense, I suppose, for all of them. And I didn't hate how the scenes played out or how their deaths happened. I just, especially for Emile and, well, really for all of them, I wanted Georges Etienne to learn that he had a daughter. I wanted Emile to have a conversation with his sister. I wanted Gabriel Antoine to accept Pascal and love her for who she is, even if it wasn't a romantic love anymore for him. And the fact that we didn't get any of those things broke my heart. And again, maybe it's realistic. We don't always get to have those final conversations. We don't always get to have that conclusion to our relationships. And maybe that ties into the larger themes of grief and loss and this idea of there always being things left unsaid and feeling like you never got enough time, no matter how much time you had, and that you didn't get to say everything. And that adds to that grief and the loss and the loneliness and that feeling that you can have. I'm going to try not to get emotional, but that feeling you can have with loss and grief, that things are, there are loose ends that haven't been tied up, and that sort of those loose ends trail behind you and get caught on things and kind of can weigh you down and just carry that grief with you in a way that maybe is realistic. I don't know. I really hope that at least somebody has read this duology and can talk to me about how they felt about the ending in the comments, because I feel like I need to talk to someone about it. I'm working really hard to convince my sister to read this duology, so hopefully she will soon so I can talk her ear off about the ending. But hopefully some of you will pick it up too if you haven't already. Like I said, I think the ending was good. It just felt a bit fast because, again, through the last quarter, we not only get Georges, Etienne and Emile and Gabriel Antoine all dying, but we also get Pascal and Alexis and Jean-Eudes and Gabriel Antoine's little sister and brother, whose names I can't remember off the top of my head, all climbing into these 2 submarines that they built essentially to fly through the super soupy toxic atmosphere of Venus, which was so freaking cool. I love the science in this book, to go up and basically take over the government, to tear down the government. And while it almost feels like it should be cliche and kind of silly for these young characters to take down the government, I feel like it had been built so well over the course of both novels, the sort of distrust, especially from the coureurs, and the complicity of the government in their suffering, in the hoarding of resources, the tight connection to the relationship with the bank and the control and the corruption. And I just feel like it made sense at that point for so many of the rest of the population of Venus, even some of the upper clouders, to be so disillusioned by their government, to be ready for a change. But the battle happened so quickly, and Pascal was really able to convince so many people to take her side, which I think she's 17, so that's quite a feat for her, where Pascal becomes the new leader of the Venusian government. And I just feel like that whole epilogue could have been a whole other book, honestly. The way that the political situation was handled throughout the books was really interesting to me, and I would have loved even more time spent on that sort of transition of government, and how would they find a new hierarchy, or would they try to go without? How are they going to share their resources? Obviously, it's going to be easier if they can continue to pull resources through the wormhole because there is so much material. There are still some limitations just due to the really harsh environment, and they only have so many habitats and so many trawlers to live on. I would have just loved to see more. That's that is my constant refrain, apparently. I think those are all my spoiler thoughts, though. I love Pascal so much. I adore her. I love Jean-Eudes so much. I love their relationship, and I'm glad that at least one of her siblings survived, because my God. That's it for spoilers. I'm done. I promise I'm done. And those are all my thoughts for the House of Saints. I really loved this. I really love this duology. I need to read everything Derek Kunkskin has ever written. I'm very grateful I got that arc for the first book. Little did I know it would become a favorite. But yay, I'm so glad I have a 5-star read for this video. I'm feeling pumped and ready for the next one. Okay, so next up, I think I want to go into fantasy, kind of pop back into the realm of fantasy next. I'm gonna go start Bookshops and Bonedust, and I'll be back when I get halfway through to let you know my thoughts. Is this going to be just as heartwarming and cozy as Legends and Lattes? I feel like it has a lot to live up to. Hopefully it can manage it. So I just finished Bookshops and Bonedust, and I really liked this. Probably unsurprising. I mean, there's always a chance that, you know, a sequel or a prequel doesn't live up to the first book, and there's a big disappointment there. Not the case here, but let me explain why I didn't do a half book update. I actually got to halfway through the book a couple hours ago, and as I was trying to think of what I wanted to say, I realized I really didn't have that much to say. Not in a bad way necessarily, but I just kind of felt very neutral about what was happening so far. I already loved Viv from the first book, so I liked seeing more Viv and seeing younger Viv. I thought that was interesting. And I was liking the other characters we were meeting, and it was very cozy and easy to read and, you know, very calm and restful and just all those like nice cozy vibes. I also, just like in Legends and Lattes, was feeling like, you know, the writing generally is pretty straightforward. It's not super flowery or anything, but there are moments that are really beautifully written, just quite lyrical little moments of description, evocative, a few, you know, very poignant moments, very elegantly phrased sentences that aren't necessarily, again, super purple prose or flowery or lyrical per se, but just very nicely smooth sentences that I really enjoy. Relationships are starting to develop. I have a sense of where things might go. Cozy, good vibes. That's about all I have to say so far. I might as well just finish and then say everything at once. So that is what I'm doing. And I'm glad I did, because the second half definitely picked up in pretty much all areas. The plot picks up. There's more mystery. There's more adventure. There's more discovery and magic and danger and excitement. There's also even more development in the characters. The found family vibes really, you know, grow to lovable levels. And I think something I found with Legends and Lattes as well is that it is that really slow burn, but by the end you feel like you know the characters and you feel like their friendships or their relationships have been earned, that they really slowly built in a really organic way, and that your relationship to them as a reader has also grown organically and slowly through the course of the book. And there's just something very nervous system calming about that. Everything just feels like it's at a leisurely pace, with the exception of the fight scenes. But I think this is something I struggled with in the first half, because obviously it's a prequel. So I already know what happens in the future. I already know that Viv doesn't stay in this town with these people because I know what happens later in her life. So I feel like there was part of me in the first half that was kind of holding back emotionally because I didn't want to get too attached to these characters, knowing she wasn't going to stay because I knew I was going to be sad when she had to leave. And I was. But eventually, over the course of the novel, it just felt like Baldry was gently pushing me closer and closer until, without even realizing it, I'd fallen in love with the characters and their friendships and this little seaside town, and I was devastated when it had to be over, which I was kind of trying to prevent, I think, subconsciously in the first half by trying not to get attached. And it happened anyway, damn it. I think what this series is showing me, while I know this about myself outside of the context of literature, I'm kind of surprised when a book pulls this out of me because in other aspects of my life, I am a very sentimental person. Very sentimental. Probably the most sentimental person I know. About random objects. You know, I'll find a little piece of paper I wrote one word on when I was 10, folded up in a random box, and I find it later and I'm like, well, I couldn't possibly throw that out, literally ever. There is no way I am attached to this. Even if I'd totally forgotten it existed until that moment and will forget afterward until the next time I see it again, I just feel attached to things. And I get that very sentimental, emotional thing. And again, I feel like that's something that doesn't necessarily apply as much to books in general for me. I feel like I can be sort of turned off by books that lean too much into sentimentality, but there are certain authors and certain books that just push my buttons in exactly the right way to pull out every single ounce of sentimentality from me without irritating me or setting off any of my alarms for inauthenticity, I guess. And I think that's what I really enjoy about Travis Baldry's work is it feels so genuine. It feels like Baldry is also a very sentimental person who loves the cozy hermit vibes, loves his friends and animals and coffee and baked goods, and just wants to deliver all those happy, cozy, relaxing vibes to people around the world. And it feels very true to him. It feels very genuine. I would be shocked to learn that he isn't that kind of a person because it just feels like it comes across in his writing so profoundly to me. And because it feels genuine to him and because it feels authentic to him, it doesn't irk me or irritate me. It doesn't feel sickly sweet. And I know other people feel differently. I know there are lots of people who find this series, or at least the first book, too sweet, too sickly sweet, too saccharine. And I could understand that. And there are other books, similar books maybe, that give me that feeling. So I've definitely been there. But again, for whatever reason, with this author, with these characters, with these books, it just feels genuine and it makes me happy. Okay. It's really sweet. It was very cozy. It was very happy. I really enjoy Viv as a protagonist. I really liked all the new characters we met in this book. I think Fern is a standout, but also Satchel. Loved Satchel. Would definitely read a whole series of books just following Satchel, traveling around, discovering new things, trying out different professions, living his life. I also loved the Griffith, which was basically an owl puppy. It was very cute. Pot roast. Adorable. Love it. Honestly, the only thing that didn't quite click for me, I would say, probably until the very end, maybe even the epilogue, was the little bit of a romantic relationship that we get in this book. And I think, again, part of that was part of my brain kind of holding back and feeling like I loved her romantic interest in Legends and Lattes so much that it was hard for me to get on board with her having feelings for anyone else. Not in a jealousy sense necessarily, or thinking that she couldn't have dated other people, but it just felt like it didn't have quite the same magic, I guess. Like I was comparing this relationship to the relationship in Legends and Lattes, and it just wasn't quite hitting the same. But then I feel like the way it ended for them made me a little emotional. And then the epilogue and the way that that was handled, and just this idea of Viv recognizing that this love earlier in her life, this brief moment of connection with someone, was something that she needed as part of her development as a person, to sort of open up her heart to love and to kind of prepare her for her current love and sort of her lifelong soulmate kind of partner, and that those loves, even the shorter loves in our life, and I think that's kind of a theme of this book in general, that, loves or friendships or just connections in our life, no matter how brief, can really touch us deeply and can change us as a person and can be just as beautiful and valuable and meaningful, even if they aren't friendships or romantic relationships for a lifetime. It doesn't mean that they don't matter. Maybe some people will sort of scoff at that as a really simple theme, but while it is, I also think it's worth writing books about things that are simple and kind and sweet. Not everything has to be world-shattering or full of sadness and suffering. I read a lot of books that are those things, and I love them too, but sometimes it's nice to just take a breather with a book, and I really feel like that's what Baldry is doing with these books, and I am calling it right now. It's probably been announced, and I'm just out of the loop as per usual, but I'm calling it right now that he's leaving this open to write a sequel to Legends and Lattes, and I would love it. This one I can see myself rereading as well, but it won't be the first one I reach for. Legends and Lattes still wins out for me, and I'm still going to give this one 5 stars because I think it deserves it, especially for how it ended and just how it made me feel by the end. This one might be more of a 4.5 stars rounded up situation. A really great read, but maybe not an absolute favorite. Whereas Legends and Lattes is just an absolute favorite of mine. I just have such a soft spot for it, and I don't not have a soft spot for this one. It's just not to the same extent, you know? Anyway, hopefully that was coherent. I don't know. I'm gonna stop because I've been talking longer than I thought I would. What else is new? And I'm gonna start my next book. I'm excited. So what do I have left? I have Nona the Ninth and Into the Riverlands, which are both on my Kobo. And then I also have The Prisoner of Heaven by Carlos Ruiz Zafón. I think I'm gonna start Prisoner of Heaven next. I'm feeling most drawn to it. This one's not super duper long. How long is this? Like 230 pages, 250 pages. So not the longest book ever, but I still plan on coming back halfway through unless I just literally have almost nothing to say, which is very uncommon for me, but sometimes does happen. Okay, I'm gonna go. See you soon. Halfway through The Prisoner of Heaven, and I don't have a huge amount to say, but I thought I'd pop in here and give my thoughts so far. I feel like so far, looking at the 3 books in the series, I feel like this one is maybe the lightest in tone. I feel like The Shadow of the Wind found a really nice balance between being sort of light and comedic and a bit silly at times, but also having this mysterious, noir, slightly spooky, slightly dark tone kind of underneath everything. And then The Angel's Game went way more into the dark area. I feel like The Angel's Game was a lot more almost leaning into psychological horror. It was quite serious and dark and spooky at times. Whereas this one so far, and who knows where it might go in the second half, but in the first half, so far this one feels quite a bit more fluffy. If that's not, I mean, you know, in comparison to the rest of the series, not maybe fluffy in comparison to other books, but this one feels a bit more focused on the character interactions and on comedy. It's not, you know, slapstick or anything, but all 3 of the books so far, this whole series has had quite a bit of humor in it, but I feel like this one, the humor is very much in the forefront, and I don't mind that. I enjoy it. I find, you know, the jokes are kind of silly most of the time, but I find them entertaining. And in this case, I feel like that dark or mysterious quality is not quite as present as in the last 2 books. So I'm personally a fan of both sides or both aspects of this series. So I do kind of hope that we get a bit more of the darkness in the second half. I mean, we are now into kind of a flashback or a story within a story portion where Fermin is talking about some of his backstory, some of his history, and it is a little darker, but it still has more of a comedic tone, the way the story's being told. It doesn't feel as ominous or tense as basically the entirety of The Angel's Game and quite a few portions of Shadow of the Wind. So I find that interesting. I'm liking it so far. We're back to spending a lot of time with Daniel, who is our protagonist in the first book, and I don't remember his exact age. I'll look it up and I'll put it on the screen, but I believe he was a teenager in the first book, and he's now solidly an adult, and we're checking in on him, seeing what's happening in his life, but we're also getting quite a few chapters in a row now of a flashback into Fermin's backstory, and that backstory seems to tie in with both of the previous books in a variety of ways. So it does feel like this book is maybe serving as a way to expand upon the world and connect more of the characters, because book one and the prologue felt quite separate in a lot of ways. There is a little bit of crossover, and we had a bit of an idea of how these stories were connected. They were taking place in a different time, so there wasn't a lot of overlap. Whereas in this book, I feel like we're going to get the chance to see how they slot together. And so far, we're already getting a little bit of an idea of how The Angel's Game and Shadow of the Wind and the characters therein connect. So that's really fun. I'm enjoying that. Not a huge amount has happened so far. I find the characters interesting. I'm still enjoying the setting in Barcelona. Now we're into the 50s. And I do like Carlos Ruiz Zafón's method of setting the scene and his descriptive writing when it comes to Barcelona. I also feel like each of the books in the series has its own commentary on the political situation in Barcelona in those decades. And so now we're kind of looking at a little bit of insight into the 50s, but mostly we're seeing a bit of commentary on Barcelona in the time of World War II, in the flashbacks that we're looking at, sort of post-war shifts in power and the political landscape in Barcelona. So that's really interesting. And I do like Zafón's writing style. Like I said, it does have quite a bit of humor to it. A lot of dry humor, but also sort of through his characters, he writes a lot of silliness. And I feel like Fermin in particular is a very sort of ridiculously silly man, and this book seems to kind of zero in on him as a character. So we're getting some zingers from Fermin, and I'm still feeling something that I've brought up, I think, in all my reviews of this series so far, which is that there are quite a few misogynistic characters in this series, and, you know, on the one hand, it makes sense for the time period for there to be misogyny, certainly. Does that mean I love reading about characters being misogynistic left, right, and center? No, I don't particularly. I don't find it so off-putting that I can't enjoy the story that's being told. I do find myself grimacing when characters randomly and unnecessarily objectify a woman or, you know, say something deeply sexist when they didn't have to, but also, would people have been talking that way in the 50s or earlier in Barcelona? Probably, just like they would have anywhere in the world in the 1950s and 40s. Doesn't mean I have to like it though. So I'm just, you know, putting a pin in it, as I have for the rest of the series, that is an aspect of it. It does feel like Zafón uses misogyny as a way to telegraph which characters are the most evil, or the characters we should root against, because they tend to be the most viciously misogynistic. But again, maybe for realism's sake, I don't know. But even the characters who we're obviously supposed to side with, and our main characters like Daniel, can also be misogynistic. That's really my only critique so far, that I find that, you know, frustrating. But you tell me what you think. Let me know your thoughts if you've read this series. But I'm having fun with it so far. I'll be curious to see where it goes next. I do have a slight concern that this will end up being less of a standalone book as book one and book two. It does feel sort of like maybe it's a book to kind of link storylines together and to get us where we need to be for whatever happens in the next book, which isn't my favorite thing on the whole in a series. I don't love, you know, bridge books that don't have their own justified plot line and character development. Maybe I'm speaking too soon and we'll end up getting more substance, and this will feel like its own sort of self-contained novel in the ways that the first two books did. But I'm getting the feeling that this might be, again, more of a bridge book. And I don't typically love that in general, but I am having fun with this so far. I don't feel like it's a waste of my time to read it, even though so far nothing has happened. So that's it. Those are my thoughts on The Prisoner of Heaven so far. I'm gonna go finish this probably this afternoon because I'm flying through it and it's quite short, like I said. So I'll be back soon. So I just filmed my entire update for this book and then realized that I forgot to turn my microphone on. Basically, I really liked this. Unfortunately, it did not live up to the greatness of book 1 and the prequel of this series. Shadow of the Wind and Angel's Game are both amazing and I love them, and I gave both of them 5 stars happily, easily, readily. This one was good. I liked it. We got to catch up with characters I like. We got to jump back into a world that I enjoy. The vibes are there. It's very atmospheric. There's a bit of a moody quality to the setting. I like the writing style. The characters have heart. I really like Fermin as a character. I loved seeing him be really fleshed out. We got so many more facets of his personality and his history and the ways that the loss and suffering that he's experienced has formed him as a person and made him into this really joyful, silly comedian of a man. And we get to see and understand on a deeper level his connection to Daniel and why they have such a great bond and this sort of uncle, nephew, best friend sort of vibe that they have going on. And while I do feel that this was a little bit more like a bonus novella, giving us backstory into Fermin and then combining a couple different plot lines and getting us ready for whatever the next book is going to be, it didn't feel as much like an entirely self-contained novel, and there wasn't as much in the present day plot as I would have hoped for to really amp up the mystery and the stakes and just flesh it out a little bit more. There are moments that should have been really exciting, that should have had scenes kind of detailing how they got there, and instead we're just sort of told quickly in summary that things worked out. And I wanted to sort of see the play-by-play and be there. So for those reasons, it felt a little lacking to me and a little bit more like just a bonus feature kind of situation or an extra novella for, you know, fans of the character to learn more about him or to set us up for the next novel. So a bit of a filler. I say that, I don't really think it's filler. I think what we learned in this book is important and interesting. I do think it was maybe rushed, I guess. I think this could have been fleshed out into a 300, 400 page novel if we'd extended the modern day portions and lived in them more moment by moment instead of sort of having summaries of these 3 separate mysteries or challenges that they face, but they're kind of rushed through. Whereas the history portion, the past timeline where we learn about Fermin's history, that felt a lot more like the primary timeline, and we got moment by moment scenes. I did like the literary references. We have references to The Count of Monte Cristo and to Les Miserables, which I enjoyed. I like the characters. I like the writing style. It's funny. Anyways, those are most of my thoughts. Unfortunately, I spoke about this at length before realizing that I didn't turn my microphone on. Yes, I am a professional YouTuber, but it is also 11 o'clock at night, and sometimes I forget things. So anyways, I liked this. I'm probably sitting around a 3.5 star, rounded up to 4 for now. Might change in the future. I do really want to read on in the series and see how I feel once I have more context, how this fits into the grand scheme of the series. Because as its own thing, as a standalone, I think it's a little weak, but maybe as sort of the glue to hold the series together, it will make a lot more sense and feel like it fits. You know, I'm being critical. I am a little disappointed, but it's still really great. And I think if you enjoyed The Shadow of the Wind and The Angel's Game, you should read this and you'll probably like it. Just maybe temper your expectations a bit because it's not as much of its own separate full novel as the other 2. So those are my thoughts. Now I'm going to go off and start both Nona the Ninth and Into the Riverlands and just see what draws me. I'm starting to run out of time for this reading vlog, so I'm just going to start both. And whatever is really pulling me in, whatever I'm able to finish in the time I have left, I will review for you. But I might have to leave one or both of them for a future video, depending on how things go in the next day or 2. So either way, I'll be back to film an outro and say goodbye and wrap things up, but I'm gonna go start both of those and see which one really draws me in. Hello, I'm back for my final update for this reading vlog. I have finished Into the Riverlands and Nona the Ninth, so I'm going to talk about both of them now. I thought about coming back for a halfway update for Nona yesterday, but I must admit, kind of similarly to Harrow the Ninth, I spent most of the first half of the book just in utter confusion. No thoughts, just vibes, no idea what's happening, no idea who anyone is, just in the weeds. So I decided to just keep reading because I remembered what it was like for Harrow the Ninth and that everything came together near the end and suddenly recontextualized a lot of the first half. I had a feeling that might happen again, so I decided to just finish it and then come back when I was done. And I'm glad I did that because the same thing happened again. So I feel like my thoughts will be a lot more coherent than they would have been if I came back halfway through. And that gave me the time to finish Into the Riverlands, which I finished maybe 2 minutes ago. So I'm actually gonna talk about Into the Riverlands first because I just finished it. It's fresh in my mind. It's a very short novella and I don't have that many things to say. So I wanna get that out of the way first, and then I'll talk about Nona the Ninth because I have a little bit more to get into there. So Into the Riverlands by Nevo. This is the third novella in the Singing Hills cycle, and The Empress of Salt and Fortune, which was the first novella, I gave 5 stars. I absolutely adored it. It's one of my favorite fantasy reads in recent years. I think about it often. I really should reread it soon because I'd be curious to see how it lands on a reread, but I loved it so much. And then the second book, The Tiger Came Down the Mountain, I liked a lot, but it didn't hit quite as hard for me, and I think I gave it 4 stars. Still loved it though. I'm sad to say, I didn't hate this. I guess I should say that first. This wasn't terrible by any means, but this is definitely my least favorite of the series so far, which I'm kind of sad about. It was fine. I just think this wasn't really my personal cup of tea. I'm 100% sure that this is just a preference thing. There's nothing wrong with this story. It's very short. It felt quite a bit shorter actually than the first two, and I don't know if that's actually accurate in terms of page count. I'd have to go back and look, but it just felt so short. It felt like we were just getting started with the story and then it was over, and the ending was quite abrupt. I really liked the new characters we met. I just felt like we didn't get enough time with them, really. The stories that were being told in this one were just a little bit less to my taste. It was a lot of fighting, and I guess in the last 2 installments there was also fighting. But I think what really resonated with me most about the first book, other than the characterization being so great, was the political intrigue. Sort of the manipulation and the machinations and the sort of working within the system part of it. Whereas this novella is just a lot more fighting. It's just people killing other people or animals, and I could take it or leave it. I'm not much of a battles person. I'm not much of a warrior person, and I can be, tricked into enjoying a story about a warrior or a story with a lot of battles if I really get the richness of the character development to hold on to, or, a fantastic, super interesting magic system, or the world building is really complex, or the writing is so evocative. In this case, I think the world building is interesting and I like the writing style and I liked the characters, but nothing was given enough time for me to really dig in and invest. It was fine though. I liked the writing. I like that this series continues to focus thematically on the power of stories and the importance of perspective in storytelling, and memory, and sort of the inconsistency of memory, but also the lies we sometimes tell ourselves or intentionally tell in storytelling to kind of portray ourselves a certain way or to ease our own regrets or guilt about certain things. Or even just in this story, there's kind of that added theme of exploring why so many stories highlight how beautiful all the people in the stories are. As someone who is a book lover, I obviously believe in the power of stories, and I do love that this series is really highlighting the importance and the value of keeping those stories alive and that tradition. And I love the idea of Chi's job as a cleric being going around and meeting as many people as possible and recording their stories. I think that's really lovely, and I continue to like that idea, but in this case, most of the stories were just, again, not really my thing, which is fine. I certainly hope that the next installments in the series are maybe a little less focused on fighting and battles and dive a little bit deeper into that inner psyche of the characters and give us more complex character development, which is what I loved so much about the first one. specifically. So 3 stars for Into the Riverlands. Definitely not bad by any means, but unfortunately my least favorite in this series so far. I will say this does a thing that is one of my pet peeves, which is depicting a character as vegetarian or vegan, but then having them cheat on their diet. They really should be a vegetarian or vegan, but no one will notice if they have some chicken or whatever. And why? Anyways, moving on from that, we have Nona the Ninth, which I finished last night. And like I said, I decided not to do a halfway update because I had no idea what was happening. And I will say that about this series in general, less so the first book. I mean, there are times in Gideon the Ninth that I was a bit lost, but usually the lost feeling didn't last past a chapter or two. I will say that Harrow the Ninth and Nona the Ninth both play with form a little bit more. They're a little more experimental in the writing style, and they are a bit confusing. And I can see for sure how this would not appeal to some people. I just feel like it's a bit more of a challenge to read, and you either have to be willing to kind of let go and just let the story wash over you and hope that you figure it out at some point, or you really dig in and try to, take notes and follow who all these different characters are and put the pieces together and check the clues and really get invested on that level. So far, I have been just the let it wash over you version, where I spend the first half of the book not entirely certain what's happening or who anyone is. And then, as things are revealed, I'm able to put the pieces together and say, oh, right, of course, that's who that is. Ah, yes, that makes sense. And it's all fine and I'm happy and it's great. I don't necessarily mind being super confused, maybe because I read a lot of weird lit or books with an experimental style. I find that kind of fun. Maybe because I have a little bit more experience with that, I don't find this too off-putting, but I also just, maybe my personality or my preferences align with things that are a little more challenging or strange. I have definitely seen people react to especially Harrow and Nona and just say, I had no idea what was happening. Like, this isn't good writing. It's confusing. I don't know what the story is. I'm not having fun. I don't want to do this. And I could totally understand why someone would feel that way. I personally love that Tamsin Muir is doing something different and playing with form and being experimental and kind of trusting the reader to figure it out eventually, even if it takes some time, and not necessarily serving everything to us on a platter and feeling like she has to hold our hand through everything and remind us of who everyone is and really, explain every single thing that happens, every reference. I enjoy being dropped in, and the world building is rich, and the culture and the language and the technology, everything is well developed, but not everything is being explained to us. We just observe it and slowly start to figure out how it works. And I kind of like that. I kind of enjoy that as an experience. So I had fun with this, but like I said, the first half, confusing. There are a couple characters from the outset who we've seen in previous books, so I knew who they were, but it's sort of intentional. Even the other characters in the book don't know who Nona is at the start. Part of the mystery for everyone involved, including Nona, is figuring out who she is. What combination of body and soul is she, and what does that mean, and does she have any powers? There's not a huge amount that I can say about this without spoilers for both this book, but also for Harrow and Gideon. So I really fell in love with Nona as a character. I really loved her gang of friends. They were so cute. It's funny because Nona is apparently, like, the body she's in is 19 years old or around there, but Nona sort of woke up without a memory 6 months ago and didn't know how to really do anything, including, dress herself or walk. And so she, in some ways, is like a little child who's just learning how to exist in the world. And she really wants to go to school, but because she's technically an adult and apparently can't learn to read or write, she's hired as a teacher's assistant or a teacher's aide instead of being a student. So she's there to just help out the teachers and do things like take the science teacher's dog for a walk during the science hour. But she ends up joining a little gang of friends of these preteens or young teenagers and very much engages with them on their level, like she was also, 13 or something. And there's something incredibly endearing about how Nona was written as a character, but also her friendships and all the different characters. Like, I particularly loved Honesty and Kevin was adorable. His contribution was basically just saying his name at various points, but he was very cute. I really loved how realistic it felt for Nona trying to fit in with this group of friends and being excited about being trusted with a secret, or having Hot Sauce, the leader of this little band of kids, hold her hand. And it was really cute. And they really grew on me by the end of the book. I also loved Noodle, the six-legged dog. He was so cute. And I was genuinely invested in his welfare through the entire book. There were a couple moments where I was worried for Noodle and his continued existence. And I'm happy to say the dog does not die. So rest assured. I won't speak about anyone else dying or living because that would be a spoiler, but I will let you know that the cute little six-legged dog is totally fine, as he should be. I also enjoyed seeing some of the characters we've met in previous installments come back, but from a very different perspective, because Nona's perspective is very childlike, and the way she interprets different personalities and relationship dynamics is from that perspective. And it's quite, again, endearing. I feel like I keep coming back to that word, but the relationships between Nona and her caregivers and some of the other characters who we've seen in previous books, again, from a very different perspective, maybe more of an adversarial, competitive, or even sexual tension or that kind of dynamic. Whereas from Nona's perspective, these are all these adults who are super cool and super badass and also incredibly beautiful. And she has a crush on all of them and also wants them to love her and care about her. And she wants to hold their hand and for her friends to meet them and see how cool her caregivers are. And it's just really, again, very endearing, very cute. And I liked getting that new perspective. As always, I'll put content warnings that I noticed while reading on the book card, but I do want to bring special attention to eating disorders in this book. Nona has what I would consider to be an eating disorder, and it comes up pretty frequently. There's a lot of focus on people asking her to eat and her not wanting to, and struggling with forcing herself to, and trying to find ways to kind of get around eating whenever possible. She also has pica and is regularly trying to eat non-food items like sand. There are reasons for it, but I will say it is pretty prominent, especially in the first half of the book, I would say. Before the action picks up, there's a lot of focus on how much she's eating and her feelings about what she's eating. As someone with my own history with eating disorders, I found it on sort of the milder end of triggering, but still definitely, registering on the meter for me. But just keep that in mind, especially if you're currently dealing with disordered eating, or if you have in the past and it's more recent for you. Please keep that in mind and take care of yourself. And if you start reading it and it feels like too much for you, maybe now is not the time and you could read it another time. I just don't want anyone to be surprised by the content and be sort of faced with that when they're not necessarily in a good place to handle it. So I felt like there was maybe an indication of why that is the case, but I'm not sure it needed to be detailed in quite as much detail as it was. Your mileage may vary. There's some interesting lore in this one. There are some mysteries from past books that are resolved, questions that are answered in this one, which was fun. There's also the inclusion, for the first time, I think, unless I'm misremembering, of the Maori people, and specifically some Maori language conventions or naming conventions, which I found interesting and was excited to see because the author is from New Zealand. And in this book, we get some flashbacks to what happened on Earth 10,000 years ago, and those flashbacks take place in New Zealand. And we learn that John Gaius is Maori, or has some Maori ancestry, which has more implications for other characters who are related to him. So that's cool, and that was interesting. Oh yeah, I should also say that while the dog doesn't die, Noodle is fine. Don't worry about Noodle. Do worry about cows in this book because they do not fare well, and not just in being killed and eaten, because a lot of books have that, and I wouldn't highlight that, but a good number of cows are killed in what I would consider to be a very gruesome way. And it keeps being brought up again and again, mostly as a joke. And mostly there is sort of commentary on how people who are not very good people or are doing bad things keep using arguments of cows having some level of sentience, or having best friends, or watching the sunset, or, whatever, like arguments that cows have emotions and are sentient, which I personally believe they are, to argue against the gruesome killing of cows that happens. I'm trying to say this in the least spoilery way possible, but they keep coming back and it's sort of delivered as a joke. And the implication is like, how ridiculous is it that they're mad about cows dying and saying, well, cows have best friends, how dare you, while they're doing this evil thing over here. And yes, sure, but also two things can be true at once. Cows can have best friends, and it can be sad for many, many cows to die gruesomely and suddenly, while other things also can be bad at the exact same time, like the destruction of the environment. I ended up really loving this. I was very invested in the characters. I found the plot in the second half pretty exciting and interesting. Like I said, I loved seeing characters from previous installments come back and getting to see them from a different perspective. I loved having multiple mysteries and loose threads resolved or tied up. And I'm really excited for the next installment. The way this one ended left me extremely excited for what's to come. And I hope that that book comes out soon. And what I enjoy about the series in general is the vast world building, the really interesting technology and magic melding together of necromancy, but also advanced technology. I really appreciate the character development, the complexity of the characters. I love the implications of lictorhood and this sort of ability of people to have multiple souls or multiple personalities in one body, or, you know, one soul to kind of take over another in their body, and what that means for these various characters and how they each handle it, both on a moral level, but also on a practical level. I also really enjoy the humor. There's a lot of humor and silliness. I really enjoy that these characters may be all powerful, but they're not incredibly reserved and stoic and perfect and heroic in every moment. They still get petty and insult each other and mumble things under their breath and swear, and also have these rich, realistic, and complicated relationships with people they love and hate in a variety of capacities. And I also felt that this book had some beautiful things to say about love. There's one quote that's about, you can't take loved away, meaning that even if our time together is short, even if you lose someone, you can't take away the fact that you loved them and they loved you. That love will always exist. It existed, you loved it into being, and now it exists and it will always exist, even if one or both of you stops existing. That love was still there. And I thought that was really beautiful, especially in a series where there's a lot of death. There are a lot of characters you fall in love with and then they die, or characters you fall in love with and then they are changed on a fundamental level, or are merged with someone else and become basically a new person. And every time that happens, there's a bit of pain. There's that loss or the grief. Anyway, I loved this. I thought it was really fun, weird, confusing, overwhelming at times, but loved the characters, loved where the story's going. This is another 5-star read for me. Very happy. So now I'm going to share some spoilery thoughts for Nona the Ninth, and then I will wrap up this whole reading vlog. So spoilers now for Nona the Ninth, also for Harrow the Ninth and Gideon the Ninth. All three. Basically, in this story, what we end up discovering pretty early on is that Nona is in Harrow's body, but it doesn't seem like this is Harrow's mind. At first, we sort of wonder, because at the start of Harrow the Ninth, Harrow has kind of forgotten a huge portion of her lived experience. So there's kind of a wonder at the start of this if somehow her whole memory has been wiped. But as we continue, her personality doesn't seem quite right for Harrow. It doesn't align, and not only because Nona is acting like a child in a lot of ways, but it just doesn't quite line up. And what we eventually learn is that this was Alecto, who is the body in the tomb, who Harrow saw a couple times as a child and fell in love with, essentially, that this is Alecto's spirit or mind in Harrow Hark's body, and Harrow is in the body's body in the tomb, asleep, and the alternating chapters that are telling the history 10,000 years ago are Harrow dreaming of Alecto's memories, basically, because Alecto, we learn, is basically the soul of planet Earth when Earth was destroyed by nuclear warfare and gave up its soul in death. John was able to basically gather that soul and build a body for it and put it into a body, and that was Alecto. And then he essentially consumed part of her soul to become a lictor with the gigantic soul of planet Earth, which gave him his godlike powers. He had already developed quite a few godlike powers before this point. He had already become a necromancer. He already had powers, but this was sort of that final stage to give him those incredible godlike powers, was becoming a lictor of some kind with a person he built and shoved the earth's soul into. So that's who Alecto is. We figured out who the body in the tomb is, and she is now awoken at the end of Nona the Ninth. And Harrow is back in her body. Gideon seems to be back in her regular body, though her personality seems slightly changed, and we don't have full answers yet as to why or how and what that means for her. But it seems like going into the next book, we're going to see Alecto as her full self with all of her memories in her own body for the first time. We're going to see Harrow with all her memories back in her body, and presumably Gideon with all her memories and back in her body, which I'm very excited about the idea of the three of them teaming up. And if they don't turn into some kind of a poly relationship, the three of them, I'm going to be very sad because I think they should be. They all love each other. Well, I guess Gideon and Alecto don't necessarily love each other, but they could. I have faith in them. I guess it could just be Harrow in an open relationship with both of them, because I feel like Harrow is in love with both of them. But anyway, I would love for them to end up together in some way, shape, or form. And I'm very excited to see what their dynamic's going to be like now that they can each exist in their own body again. It's been a little complicated up to this point. But sadly, Nona was really just a fragment of Alecto, or Alecto's consciousness without any memories, with maybe, it's implied, maybe there was a little sprinkling of Gideon at the very least in that personality as well. So Nona has basically ceased to exist, and I'm sad about that because I really liked Nona. I was worried at first, honestly, because I was thinking, okay, she's 19, but she's acting like maybe a 7-year-old, and I feel like this is going to get a bit tiresome for me if the book continues in this way. But instead I just grew to really love her, and I was very attached to her. So the idea that she no longer exists, as far as we know, was quite sad, but again sort of ties in with that theme and, you know, some of the quotes in the book about losing someone or someone changing fundamentally does not mean that your love disappears, and appreciating the time you had together and so on and so forth. So I'm going to try to appreciate the time I had with Nona, even if it was short, and be excited that the way that Nona the Ninth ended means that maybe some of my other favorite characters like Harrowhark and Gideon get to exist in their own bodies again, and we can maybe see them interact again the way they did in the first book, which I have missed ever since. I'm also mourning the loss of Camilla and Palamedes. They were basically, Palamedes was haunting Camilla, possessing her occasionally. So we got to see both of them, and when one of them was using Camilla's body, the other one wasn't conscious and didn't remember what happened. So we kind of got to see both of them as independent people still. But at the end of the book, they essentially merge into a brand new person named Paul. And I'm sad about that because they are characters I've really enjoyed. So I'm not sure how to feel about them being merged into a brand new person, which again just ties with so many of the themes here of, you know, the only constant is change. I sound like Lauren in Parable of the Sower, but, you know, people change and people die, and we love anyway because that's what makes life worth living, but I'm still sad about it. I also really liked Pyrrha. I feel like we got to know her a tiny bit in Harrow the Ninth, if I remember correctly, but she got way more characterization in this one, and I loved her dynamic with Nona. She was such a lovely mother figure for Nona, and so sweet and caring and supportive, and I loved their dynamic. It was adorable and very sad that Nona is now gone. I felt like this book did a great job of really deepening the character development of several of the characters who we've met through the course of the series already. I am a bit worried about Gideon because she seemed so different and very reserved in this book. She's only really in the very end, but she doesn't quite seem herself. And I don't know if that's because there was a portion of her personality or spirit that was somehow locked in Nona that maybe she will get back now, or it's just everything that's happened to her that we know of, but also anything that might have happened to her since the end of Harrow the Ninth that we're not necessarily up to date on, and spending time with her father, the god, who is very vengeful, maybe has changed her. And I'm kind of worried about that because I loved Gideon as she was in the first book, and if she didn't change at all, that would feel very unrealistic because she's been through a lot. But I also don't want her to lose all of the spark that made her her, you know, and her being way more reserved is kind of odd. Though she did have some sassy one-liners right at the end there, especially as Alecto was waking up. So maybe there is hope for their dynamic to come back. I would love that because I really loved Harrow and Gideon's dynamic in the first book. There's also some commentary in this one, I would say, about the refugee experience and the way children are impacted by that instability and potential loss of family. I really loved the teachers in this book and how caring and lovely they were with the kids. And there was just something very heartbreaking about characters like Hot Sauce and honesty and hearing about their home life and their experiences and not really knowing how things are going to turn out for them and if they're going to be okay. I think this book did the most of any of the books so far because of these other characters we meet to really humanize the large population of people who are not in the houses, who are suffering under this regime and just trying to stay safe and get by while these, you know, world-shattering battles and power struggles happen around them, the human cost in these kinds of wars. I did also really appreciate the way that this book explored how John became a god and how he lost touch with his humanity and his empathy, lost a sense of the value of a human life, and how that really slowly, gradually grew over time to the point where he could kick off nuclear war and kill basically the entire human race in an instant and not necessarily feel any particular way about it, really. It was pretty chilling, but I also felt like it was very well handled to take someone who is, for all intents and purposes, a regular human being with no special powers, discovering special powers, and then slowly that going to their head and slowly that shifts their values and their morals, especially because their power involves being able to control dead things and the idea that killing more things gives them more power, and they start to lose touch with what made them human and what gave them that sense of humanity and compassion and empathy and a moral code. I thought it was really well handled. And again, like I said, very chilling and creepy, but also very interesting. So I think that's it for my spoilery thoughts. That's Nona the Ninth. I love this. I'm giving it 5 stars. I'm really excited to read Alecto the Ninth, and I hope it comes out soon because I need to know what happens. I might do a full reread of the whole series before it comes out because there's just so much in this series when it comes to the world building and the characters and the magic and the technology and the lore and the history. There's just a lot of threads, and it's confusing. It's overwhelming at times. I think I might get the most out of the last book from reminding myself of the first 3 in as much detail as possible before I start. So that might have to happen, but I'm really excited regardless. I'm going to do a ranking to wrap this up. This is going to stand in for Nona the Ninth. This is going to stand in for Into the Riverlands. Okay, so I think this is my ranking. This is a bit of a struggle. Into the Riverlands on the bottom with 3 stars. Then for my 4-star reads, Prisoner of Heaven, and then Bringer of Dust. And then for my 5-star reads, a challenge, because I loved all 3 of them, and they're quite different books, but I think Bookshops and Bonedust, and then Nona the Ninth, and then House of Saints. The House of Saints made me cry by far the most, and was the most emotionally intense and the most visceral. The ending was a bit rushed, but honestly, for Nona the Ninth, I felt like the ending was rushed there too, a little bit. The pacing was a bit uneven in a similar way. And Bookshops and Bonedust made me get teary-eyed once or twice, and I did really enjoy it. But it was more of like a warm hug, cozy break from the world, whereas these 2 had way more in terms of world building and technology and political machinations, and just they were much more complex, which I typically enjoy. Anyways, that's it for me. Thanks so much for watching. Give this video a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Let me know your thoughts on the books I read in this video if you've read them. I'm curious to hear your ratings and where you agree or disagree with me. And let me know if you have any recommendations for books I should read or series I should check out, or just future reading vlog ideas, concepts, themes that you'd be interested in, because I'm always looking for more ideas. But with that, I'm gonna get going. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you really soon in my next one. Bye, friends.